Welcome back to the Noir Archive. Today, we open a secret archive from World War II. This is the dark history of the Vault of Neuschwanstein, a fairy tale castle turned into a fortress for the world's most dangerous stolen treasures. Behind these stone walls lies a story of greed, art, and a secret operation that nearly changed the face of history forever. The Alps, April 1945. The wind didn't just blow through the old pine ridges, it howled through the rock crevices like the screams of a collapsing era. Amidst the thick fog and the biting cold of Bavaria, Neuschwanstein Castle emerged like a giant ghost, solitary and melancholic. In the deadly silence of the night, Wagner's music no longer echoed, nor was there any shadow of royal banquets. Instead, there was a dry, terrifyingly rhythmic sound, the hobnailed boots of fascist troops pounding against the marble floor. The flickering light from oil lamps cast long, lingering shadows on the walls, dancing around the vibrant frescoes that were now obscured by towering stacks of crude wooden crates. Neuschwanstein Castle, once the most insane and romantic dream of the Swan King, Ludwig II. A castle stepping right out of a fairy tale, built to honor beauty and escapism from reality. But in the final hours of World War II, that dream had turned into a tangible nightmare. The symbol of pure beauty had been tainted, becoming a massive warehouse, a prison holding the greatest stolen treasures in human history. Why was a fortress of romance chosen to conceal the cultural crimes of the Third Reich? What truly lies behind those heavy oak doors, under the strict guard of the last desperate SS soldiers? The answer lies in the classified files we are about to uncover. Because, on our journey deep into the dark corridors of Neuschwanstein today, we are not just talking about gold or precious stones. We are talking about the soul of Europe imprisoned within stone walls. Welcome back to Noir Archive. Today, we will step into the vault of ambition and sin. In the darkness of the 1940s, as the clanking tracks of panzer tanks crushed the cobblestone streets of Europe, another war was being waged, silently but no less brutally. It was not a war for every inch of land, but a war to eradicate the souls of nations. It was known as the invasion of the intellectual thieves. The mastermind behind this plan was not a general directly commanding troops in battle, but Alfred Rosenberg, an extremist ideologue, considered the chief architect of Hitler's racial doctrine. Rosenberg did not view art through the eyes of an admirer, he saw it as a political tool and a racial trophy. In 1940, under direct orders from the Führer, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, Heer, was established. Initially, their mission was simply to collect the books and documents of the enemies of the empire, Jews, communists, and secret societies. But when Paris fell, the greed of Rosenberg and Hitler swelled beyond control. Their ultimate goal was to build the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria, a mega-museum that would become the cultural center of the world, displaying all the artistic masterpieces humanity had ever created, but under the exclusive ownership of the Aryans. To realize that dream, Europe had to be stripped bare of its cultural garment. Rosenberg turned the Heer into the most sophisticated looting machine in history, where men in uniform carried not guns, but inventory lists and art measuring tapes. Imagine an autumn morning in Paris in 1940. A terrifying silence enveloped the Louvre Museum. The ash-gray military trucks of the Wehrmacht parked along the banks of the Seine, their exhaust fumes blurring the trees as their leaves changed color. This was not a routine military requisition, it was an artistic purge. While the people of Paris lived in fear of rifles, inside the lavish mansions of the Rothschild family, air officers nonchalantly flipped through paintings, touching every priceless antique. The Rothschild family, a symbol of Jewish wealth and power, was a prime target. Hundreds of paintings by masters like Rembrandt and Vermeer were taken down from walls and crated up like ordinary merchandise. At the Jeu de Paume Museum, chosen as the transit hub for the stolen treasures, the scene resembled a devil's workshop. Nazi art experts, holding PhDs and possessing deep knowledge of painting, were now working tirelessly to categorize the loot. They divided them into several categories: items reserved exclusively for Hitler's museum, pieces for Hermann Göring's private collection, and anything deemed degenerate art, like the works of Picasso or Matisse, which would be destroyed or sold off cheaply to fund the war. There was something bizarre and terrifying in the Nazi method of looting, an insane meticulousness. Why would a thief spend hours recording the dimensions, condition, and origin of the item they had just stolen? Every painting, every statue confiscated by the heir was assigned a code and attached to a detailed inventory card. They photographed each item, creating massive archival records that would later become ironclad evidence in court. This was not merely the German habit of neatness, it was the ultimate expression of arrogance. The Nazis believed they were rewriting history. They documented it because they believed this empire would last 1,000 years, and these records were the victor's legal certificate of ownership over human civilization. In the minds of Rosenberg and his subordinates, they were not thieves. They were rescuers of art from races they considered inferior, bringing them back to where they believed they rightfully belonged, the Third Reich. Every pen stroke on the inventory sheet was a mark asserting absolute dominance over the past, present, and future of Europe. When the storage vaults in Paris became overloaded, the operation to transport the treasures began. This was one of the most complex and secretive transport operations of World War II. Special trains, given priority even over troop or equipment transports, began rolling out of the stations, heading east. Imagine tightly sealed train cars holding masterpieces like Vermeer's Woman Holding a Balance or Picasso's abstract works inside. These trains moved at night, under the strict protection of the SS. They crossed borders ablaze with war, heading toward secret locations deep underground or on high mountain peaks. At that time, the chaos of war was the perfect cover. Allied bombs rained down on train stations, but miraculously, or due to the terrifyingly precise calculations of German logistics, these art trains still reached their destinations. Their final destination was not Berlin, which was slowly turning into a pile of rubble under Air Force firepower, but a place much more remote, safer, and full of mystery. It was where the peaks of the Alps soared high, where fog wrapped around grey stone castles. The wooden crates bearing the air labels began being loaded onto trucks traversing mountain passes, heading toward the fortress in the clouds, Neuschwanstein. When the phantom trains of the air left burning Paris, they did not head toward Berlin, which was gradually becoming a graveyard of rubble and ashes under Allied bombardments. Instead, they headed south, toward the majestic ranges of the Bavarian Alps. There, appearing faintly behind thick fog and sheer cliffs, was Neuschwanstein, an architectural masterpiece that seemed to exist only in the craziest dreams of King Ludwig II. But in 1941, that dream was hijacked by a brutal war machine. Why Neuschwanstein? The answer lies at the intersection of cold military strategy and the deeply sick, personal obsessions of the leaders of the Third Reich. In the middle phase of the war, the German skies were no longer safe. Squadrons of American B-17 and British Lancaster bombers tore up industrial centers and key transport hubs. However, the Bavarian Alps region was a different story. Neuschwanstein was located in a position that strategists called a radar and aviation blind spot. Built on a towering rocky outcrop, surrounded by year-round snow-capped peaks and dense old-growth forests, the castle was practically invisible to high-altitude bomber squadrons. More importantly, there were no significant military or industrial targets around Neuschwanstein. To Allied pilots, wasting bombs on a fairy tale castle in the middle of nowhere was absurd. The Nazis exploited this very military uselessness to turn the place into the safest refuge in the world. Neuschwanstein was not just a warehouse, it was a spiritual fortress, a place where Hitler believed the core values of Aryan civilization would be preserved even if the outside world collapsed. The Alpine fog didn't just hide the castle from enemy eyes, it also blanketed the cultural crimes taking place within its cold, grey stone walls. Step through the heavy oak doors to go inside. A breathtaking contrast will unfold before your eyes. This is where the noir style most clearly illustrates the juxtaposition between absolute beauty and the brutality of power. Neuschwanstein was originally designed as a stage for Richard Wagner's operas. The halls, radiant with gold, the frescoes depicting the Knights of the Holy Grail, were now deformed. The Thronsaal, throne hall, where a king's throne was supposed to sit, was now empty, replaced by thousands of crude pine crates stacked all the way to the ceiling. The light from the stained glass windows reflected onto the air symbols and the dark swastikas on the crates, creating a gloomy and grotesque scene. Over 20,000 priceless items were packed tightly into every square meter of the castle. From the paintings of Vermeer and Rubens to the Rothschild family's jewelry collections and French royal furniture. The Sängersaal, Singers' Hall, which possessed the finest acoustics, was now silent of song, leaving only the rustling of inventory paper and the dry sound of hammering nails. The artistic masterpieces, originally created to breathe the air of freedom and light, were now imprisoned in darkness, mummified in layers of dry straw and rags. The castle was no longer a dwelling of romance, it had become a cemetery for stolen cultural souls. Life inside Neuschwanstein during the war years was a terrifying silence. Here, the heir dispatched a special unit of art historians, restoration experts, and librarians, those dubbed the intellectual thieves. They worked under the strict supervision of the Gestapo secret police and local SS units. These individuals, who had spent their whole lives studying beauty, were now facing a horrific moral paradox: they were preserving art for the very people who had destroyed the world. They lived in freezing rooms without heating to ensure the proper humidity for the paintings. Their meals were meager, and communication with the outside world was practically non-existent. During the long winter nights, as the snowy wind howled outside the cliffs, the atmosphere inside the castle was thick with fear. They knew they were holding treasures that could buy an entire nation, but they also knew they were merely pawns in a massive gamble. Any minor mistake in the inventory, any suspicious glance could lead them straight to concentration camps. They worked like machines, logging and crating in absolute silence, turning themselves into a part of the darkness enveloping the castle. The real reason Neuschwanstein was chosen also lay in the profound personal connection of Adolf Hitler. Since his days as a failed painter in Vienna, Hitler had been obsessed with the architecture of Neuschwanstein and the music of Wagner. To him, this castle was the embodiment of the pure German spirit. He frequently reviewed the photographs of the treasures kept here, considering them the first building blocks of his thousand-year cultural empire. There are records of Hitler secretly ordering the heir to send special photo albums of the Neuschwanstein treasures to his bunker, Führerbunker, for his amusement during his final, desperate days. But if Hitler saw this as an ideal symbol, Hermann Göring, the second most powerful man in the empire, viewed Neuschwanstein as a high-end personal department store. Göring, with his bottomless greed for art, had made multiple secret visits via his private train to the Bavaria region. Imagine the scene: Göring, in his luxurious leather coat, strolling between the rows of wooden crates in the castle hall, pointing at priceless paintings and ordering them to be shipped to his Karen Hall estate. Between Hitler and Göring, there was a bitter underlying rivalry to snatch the finest items. Neuschwanstein was not merely a national treasure vault, it was a showcase of the moral corruption of the rulers, a place where art was degraded into toys for the vanity of monsters. By the end of 1944, as the German army began retreating across all fronts, the silence at Neuschwanstein grew even heavier. The air experts began hearing rumors that the Allies had crossed the Rhine. The fortress in the clouds no longer felt safe. The wooden crates still lay there, silent and cold, holding the essence of centuries. But now, a new fear emerged: if Germany fell, what would happen to this treasure? Would they be blown up per Hitler's scorched earth orders, or would they fall into the hands of the victors? In the Alpine night, the flickering light from the highest rooms of Neuschwanstein still glowed, signaling that the game was not yet over. A new force was approaching, men who carried not guns to destroy, but maps to save what remained of human civilization. In 1945, the Third Reich was dying. The cities that were once the pride of Germany were now just skeletons of steel and rubble. While the Allied armored divisions were tightening the siege around Berlin, a special group of people was waging a completely different kind of war. They were not hunting down fascist generals, they were not occupying strategic military bases. What they were looking for were the imprisoned fragments of humanity's soul. They were the monuments men, soldiers who carried maps instead of guns, men embarking on a breathtaking race against time to prevent the destruction of history at Neuschwanstein Castle. Before the first American soldiers set foot in the Alps, the key to unlocking the doors of Neuschwanstein was forged in an unexpected place, the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. There, a woman lived the life of a silent and highly dangerous spy. That was Rose Valland. Rose was not a warrior. She was a slender, bespectacled museum curator who seemed invisible to the air officers. Throughout the 4 years of occupation, Rose Valland silently endured the humiliation of watching her homeland's treasures being looted right before her eyes. But beneath that submissive exterior lay a will of steel. She knew German but always pretended not to understand a single word. This allowed her to stand hidden in the shadows, listening to the secret conversations of German officers, and most importantly, secretly taking notes. Every night, after the SS soldiers were drunk or had left, Rose would sneakily open her notebooks, recording every crate number, every train car, and their destinations. When the trains began heading towards southern Germany with mysterious code names, Rose knew the final destination was Neuschwanstein. Her tiny notebook was the only red thread guiding the Allied experts later on. Without the insane bravery of Rose Valland, who could have been executed immediately if discovered, the treasure at Neuschwanstein might have vanished forever into the void of history. As Allied forces advanced into Europe, military leaders realized a disaster: their own bombs were destroying millennial heritage. To prevent this, the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, MFAA, also known as the Monuments Men, was established. This was the strangest unit in military history. Their members were not 18 or 20-year-old youths full of fighting spirit. They were middle-aged museum directors, architects, and art historians from prestigious universities like Harvard or Yale. They wore military uniforms, but their souls belonged to the halls of art. These men were thrown into the middle of a brutal battlefield with a seemingly impossible mission: to protect historical monuments and recover millions of stolen items. They had to travel in beat-up jeeps, lacking food and fuel, often facing the skepticism of commanding generals, those who considered saving a painting secondary to winning a battle. But to men like James Rorimer or Lincoln Kirstein, they understood: if we win this war but lose our history, then that victory will become meaningless. They began their journey from the ruins of Normandy, following Rose Valland's fragile clues, and eventually turned their eyes to the distant Alpine peaks, where Neuschwanstein was hiding. In April 1945, the Monuments Men's journey into the Alps was like a melancholic and tense noir film. Roads were destroyed, bridges were blown up by fleeing German troops. But the biggest threat was not the terrain, but the werewolf organization. These were the last loyal groups of German soldiers, men who had sworn to fight to their last breath in the old-growth forests and ravines. They carried out bloody ambushes, laid mines, and assassinated anyone who approached the final secrets of the Reich. The members of the Monuments Men frequently had to move in the dark, with all headlights turned off, listening to the slightest sounds from the sheer cliffs above. The air was thick with unease. The Alpine fog no longer possessed its poetic beauty, it became a veil for sniper rifles. Every step they took toward Neuschwanstein Castle was a gamble with death. They knew they were entering the Alpine fortress, the place where German propaganda claimed Hitler and his loyal army would make their final stand. As the Monuments Men approached the foot of the mountain, classified information arrived that made their hearts skip a beat. The Nero Decree had been issued by Adolf Hitler on March 19, 1945. In his final madness, Hitler had ordered a complete scorched earth policy. The order clearly stated, all military transport and communication facilities, industrial establishments, and supply depots, as well as anything else of value within Reich territory, must be destroyed so as not to fall into enemy hands. For the fanatics at Neuschwanstein, this meant they had to blow up the castle along with the 20,000 masterpieces inside. Fear enveloped the MFAA experts. They imagined thousands of paintings by Vermeer, Rembrandt, or sculptures by Rodin going up in smoke in a massive explosion. Neuschwanstein, the fortress in the clouds, could become a giant stone tomb. During sleepless nights by makeshift campfires at the base of the mountain, James Rorimer asked himself, will we arrive in time? Or will we only see the ashes of civilization? They no longer had time to wait for the support of large infantry units. The race was now between exhausted historians and the detonators already planted beneath the castle's stone floors. On April 29, 1945, the jeeps of the Monuments Men, along with a squad of soldiers from the U.S. 7th Infantry Division, finally saw the sharp spires of Neuschwanstein piercing through the fog. The castle still looked majestic and eerily silent. There was no gunfire, nor was there any smoke or fire rising. But that silence was the most terrifying thing of all. Had the SS troops retreated? Or were they hiding behind those narrow windows, their hands on the detonators? They began moving up the steep road leading to the main gate. Every turn of the wheels was a wildly beating heartbeat. When James Rorimer stood before the giant oak doors, he knew that behind this door lay one of two things, either the world's greatest treasure or a deadly trap that would wipe out all of them along with human history. The wind howling through the Alpine rock crevices seemed to urge them on. It was time to face the truth. It was time to open the Nazis' Pandora's box. The giant oak doors of Neuschwanstein let out a dry screech as they were pushed open. The soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division and the Monuments Men experts entered on high alert. There were no snipers, no explosive booby traps. There was only a chilling silence and the smell of pine wood, dust, and the mustiness of rooms that had been sealed off for years. As the beams from military flashlights began sweeping through the darkness of the grand halls, a surreal world gradually revealed itself. It was a moment where history was suspended, where the darkness of fascist crimes collided with the brilliant light of human civilization. Imagine you are a 19-year-old private from Ohio, who just survived the bloody battles in the Hurtgen Forest, now standing in the Singers' Hall, Sangersaal, of a fairy tale castle. Under the dim flashlight, you don't see the enemy, but thousands upon thousands of crude wooden crates stacked up like maze walls. A Monuments Men expert signaled to open the first crate. The sound of a crowbar prying wood echoed sharply in the silent space. As the lid popped off, the dry straw was brushed aside, and then, a radiant golden light reflected back. It was a solid gold religious statue, sparkling under the flashlight as if it had just been taken out of heaven. In another corner, paintings belonging to the Rothschild family, masterpieces the world thought were lost, were stacked in layers. The faces in Rembrandt's paintings stared at the American soldiers with melancholy and nobility. Brilliant gilded frames, exquisite Meissen porcelain sets, massive Gobelins tapestries. Everything was crammed into crude crates. The scene looked like the dream of the world's craziest scrap collector, who had decided to steal the very soul of Europe and lock it inside a stone cage. Among the thousands of treasures, there was one item that made even the most seasoned art experts hold their breath. It was the Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eyck brothers. Considered the most important and most frequently stolen artwork in history, the Ghent altarpiece was Hitler's ultimate prize. This work is not just a painting, it is a massive altarpiece consisting of multiple panels, depicting the salvation of humanity with astonishingly realistic detail. In the darkness of Neuschwanstein, as the panels of the Ghent altarpiece were revealed, the soldiers seemed to forget they were in a war. They stood in stunned silence before the beauty of the mystic lamb. The Nazis were obsessed with this artwork because they believed it contained a secret code leading to powerful religious relics. But to the Monuments Men, finding it here was a greater victory than any battle. It was a symbol that beauty had survived the guns of tyranny. The presence of the Ghent altarpiece in the Neuschwanstein vault was the most undeniable proof of the scale and madness of the looting campaign initiated by Rosenberg. When the inventory began, the numbers left everyone staggered. Not hundreds, but more than 21,000 individual art objects were found in this castle alone. The US military mobilized combat photographers to document every scene. Thousands of black and white photos were developed on the spot, photos of American soldiers holding priceless paintings, photos of endless rows of wooden crates, and especially the surviving inventory records of the heir itself. These documents were the ultimate backfire. The German meticulousness in recording their own crimes now became irrefutable evidence for the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials. Every photograph taken at Neuschwanstein was a fierce indictment against Alfred Rosenberg and the fascist leadership for crimes against human cultural heritage. People didn't just see paintings, they saw evidence of a systematic plan to destroy national identities. There was a deeply moving noir moment when the infantrymen, men accustomed only to mud, gunpowder, and death, realized the value of where they were standing. They began passing around small items, handwritten manuscripts from the Middle Ages, the stripped wedding rings of Jewish families. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We felt so small. These things existed hundreds of years before we were born and will exist hundreds of years after we are gone. We are not just occupying a castle, we are guarding the souls of our ancestors." That feeling of standing amidst a 2,000-year flow of history changed the atmosphere in the castle. The playful jokes of combat soldiers faded, replaced by a strange reverence. They realized that no matter how brutal this war was, no matter how many millions of lives had been lost, there were still values that even fascist brutality could not entirely extinguish. Neuschwanstein, from a warehouse of ambition, had become a temporary cathedral for beauty. The American soldiers, with their rough hands still smelling of gunpowder, became the silent protectors of humanity's greatest treasure. As the first trucks began moving the treasures out of the castle to collecting points in Munich, the sun began to set behind the Alpine peaks. The sallow light of dusk reflected on the sharp spires of Neuschwanstein, creating a scene that was both glorious and melancholic. The treasures were rescued, but the story was not over. Finding them was only the first step. The journey to return them to their rightful owners, many of whom had not survived the crematoriums, was another long, drawn-out battle. But that night, in the dark rooms of the castle, for the first time in years, the Alpine fog seemed less cold. Neuschwanstein had shed its burden of sin. The ghosts of plunder were retreating, making way for new pages of history being written by the unsung heroes of the monument's men. When the last trucks left the gates of Neuschwanstein Castle, a dark chapter of history seemed to close. But for the art world, it was only the beginning of a long and agonizing journey to reclaim identity. The aftermath left by the heirs looting campaign was a massive, unfillable void. The process of art restitution has lasted for over 80 years and continues to this day. Many masterpieces found at Neuschwanstein were returned to national museums, but thousands of other items privately owned by Jewish families became orphans. Many of their true owners remained forever in concentration camps, and their heirs had to spend decades in tense legal battles to reclaim what belonged to their families. Every returned painting is not just an asset, but a shattered fragment of memory mended after the firestorm. However, not everything was found. History always has haunting silences. To this day, rumors of other secret vaults deep in the Alps still keep treasure hunters awake at night. How many wooden crates were thrown into the depths of Lake Chiemsee or Lake Alad when the SS fled? How many priceless paintings by Picasso or Matisse were incinerated for being deemed degenerate art? These cultural debts remain a mystery. Perhaps, deep beneath the eternal snows of Bavaria, treasures still lie dormant, waiting for the flashlight of a future generation to reach them. Today, Neuschwanstein has returned to its appearance as a fairy tale destination, welcoming millions of visitors each year. People come here to admire the romantic beauty of King Ludwig II, to take sparkling photos in the sunlight. But when night falls and the fog from the valley begins to shroud the sharp spires, the castle appears with its inherent melancholy. In the cold grey stone corridors, the echoes of hobnailed boots and the rustle of air inventory lists still seem to linger. Neuschwanstein can never completely shake off its past as a prison for art. It stands as a silent witness to the terrifying intersection between absolute beauty and the utmost moral corruption. We close the file on Neuschwanstein with one final reflection: does art exist to elevate the human soul, or is it merely a tool for the vanity of those in power? When you gaze at a masterpiece in a museum, ask yourself, what is the true price of beauty when it was once washed in blood, tears, and expropriation? Thank you for joining Noir Archive. See you in the next classified files of history.